Okay, so with this project, what I've asked you to do is to have a glass and another object. So that object could be a piece of fruit or a spoon, okay? Because what I thought would be quite interesting is when you put, the spoon into the glass, what we see are these lovely kind of distortions that happened. Now you can also fill part of that up with water as well, and that kind of creates something else as well. So just have a bit of a play around with how you want to put your glass and your object together. The other thing to think about is where you're going to place it. So I'm just going to illustrate this very simply by introducing different colours in. For example, if you placed your glass onto this kind of black background, and then you had your spoon inside it, for example, you can see what happens to the kind of transparency of it. Similarly, with a white background, and if you put the spoon in, you can kind of see that changes it again completely. If you suddenly had a patterned background, what happens then? So these are all the things to kind of consider when you're putting that composition together. What background are you going to use? Are you going to have a piece of paper, white sheet of paper, just to kind of exclude all other pattern and reflections and really just concentrate on what's happening? Or do you want to have a really super pattern background to place your object on and give yourself that extra kind of challenge in a sense? So that's something to think about before you get started. Okay, so the first thing that we need to look at with this project is the drawing of our object. So I'm going to draw or do a painting of this glass, okay, and what I'm going to do is fill mine with liquid and put a spoon in it just to kind of see what happens, because there's some really interesting things that happened with the distortion of things. But we first need to look at the drawing. So I'm just going to kind of illustrate this really. That's the easiest way of doing it. So when we look at something from the top like this, okay, so what we can see is this lovely kind of circle here. Okay, and then when it goes into perspective, okay, you can see what happens is that it then becomes this lovely ellipse like this. Okay, now the easiest way to describe it is if I was going to draw a box around it, and then when it goes off into perspective, this is what happens. Now sometimes I kind of say to people, draw a cross going through the kind of middle of the ellipse and going straight down the center of it, and then you can kind of see if you've got that completely correct. You can see if one side is wonky or incorrect or whatever. So that really helps. Okay. Now once I've got that and I've got my vertical line going down the middle, that's going to really help me with the drawing. So I can then use my pencil and I can measure across, and if I wanted to, I can put little marks every now and then just to make sure that I've got these in the right place and the distance is completely correct. There we go. I always find one side easier to draw than the other for some reason. Don't know why that is. So we've got our kind of shape of our glass. Okay. The other thing to kind of bear in mind is that try and keep these bottom parts here really nice and kind of rounded. What you don't want to see is kind of sharp corners like this. Okay, that doesn't look so realistic really. Okay, so there I've got my glass, and from that we can then start building the rest of the drawing. Okay, I hope that's helpful, and we'll get on to the painting. let's look at our colour palette now. So I've got Windsor yellow, but you can use cadmium yellow if you haven't got the Windsor yellow. We've got alizarin crimson. We have got, in our blue section, we have got French ultramarine or cobalt blue. Either of those will work really, really well. And lastly, we've got burnt umber. I'm going to ask you to try and stick to these 3 primaries. So you can either choose one of those, okay? It doesn't matter which. And the burnt umber. So just those 4 colours, okay? So I've done my drawing. And the first thing that I'm going to do is actually use my masking fluid to mask out any areas that need masking out, where the light is kind of catching the glass and my spoon. Okay, so really kind of the main areas that I really want you to think about is the rim of the glass here. So on mine, when I've got mine set up, I can see the light kind of hitting it here. You know, it hits it at various points on the spoon as well. So all of these kind of areas where I can see it's very, very white, or I've got that lovely kind of little strip of light, now's the time to mask all those out. There might be areas like here at the bottom as well where it needs masking out. So I'm going to go ahead and put all of those masked out areas in, and I'm going to let it dry. And I'll meet you back here in a sec. Right, so I've masked off all my areas where I want to kind of keep little bits of highlights. I'm hoping that you can kind of see that. And I've positioned my palette, so hopefully you can see the way that I'm mixing colours. So I have got cobalt blue, I've got Windsor yellow, I've got my alizarin crimson here, just out of shot. I'll just move that a little bit. And I've got my burnt umber here. So I'm just going to stick with those 4 colours. And to begin with, I'm going to use my nice big brush. I have also got my squirrel mop, and I've also got a finer one as well, which is my rigger, which I might need for kind of doing some of the finer line work. Excuse me. Right, let's get started. So the first thing that I'm going to do is actually kind of block in some of the background first, so that I can kind of isolate the glass itself. So I'm just mixing some of my burnt umber, a little bit of the Windsor yellow, just to kind of make a kind of neutral kind of colour for the background. So, as always, I'm using plenty of water, so I'm just going to be a little bit careful going around the edge of that glass. Okay, comes down a little bit there on that side. Again, just being a little bit more sort of careful around the edges, where I kind of really need to make sure that it doesn't go over. So unlike my kind of normal way of painting, which is kind of very, very loose, when it comes to painting glass, you kind of have to, unfortunately, kind of rein it in a little bit, which for me is quite difficult because I like being quite splashy. So I'm going to try and sort of keep this as loose as I possibly can, but really this is about the most sort of controlled painting that I'm sort of gonna, about as controlled as I'm going to be, really. kind of comes down here a little bit, and then it definitely kind of gets a little bit lighter as it comes down here. I'm just going to soften that edge a little bit. So the top part you can see is very, very wet. I don't know whether you can see that. Okay, so now that I've got that in, that allows me then to start working inside the glass a little bit. So I'm just going to change that colour a little bit. So I'm unfortunately, when you're viewing it, it's kind of seeming a little bit darker, but you know, you can see, you know, in fact it's a very, very kind of thin wash, and you can see how thin it is by the, you know, by the way in which I'm kind of moving it. So although on screen it looks like it's quite dark, actually it's not very dark at all. It's very, very thin. Okay, because again, as always, we're going to work in layers. You know, we're going to work in, so this is going to be our first layer. So I'm kind of being careful wherever I've kind of got highlight. I'm being quite careful just to kind of make sure actually I might drop down to my slightly smaller brush now. Didn't use that big one for very long. Too yellow, that is. Okay, some of that kind of colour comes down into here as well. So I'm just going to bring that down as well. So what I'm doing now is kind of really looking at some of the shapes that I can see within the glass. Does get a little bit kind of darker along that edge. So my glasses seems to have this kind of sort of greenish tinge to it. So really kind of look at that with your glass. I mean, it seems that every sort of glass has got a slightly different tinge. You know, some of them are a little bit bluer, others are kind of a little bit more green. Mine seems to have this kind of greeny blue sort of tinge. So that's what I'm kind of working with. Okay, and as I come down, it definitely becomes a lot lighter down here. In fact, here it becomes very, very blue, so I'm going to maybe actually just start putting that in as well. I've got this very sort of blue tinge down here, especially more towards the edges actually. Greeny kind of blue colour. Sorry, I'm also going quiet when I'm kind of concentrating a little bit. So excuse these kind of silent moments. So what I've done with mine is I've actually filled it with some water. just to kind of make it a little bit more interesting for myself, really. I quite like all these. I'm just going to tie some of that kind of blue that I've got down here. I'm going to sort of try and sort of tie it in a little bit up here, just so that it doesn't look so out of place, really. So I'm just going to put a little bit of that down up here. And it does kind of seem to me that in the film itself, it's I'm looking now and it just seems very, very dark what I'm doing, but actually it's super light. It's very, very pale. Just, you know, because remember, this is our first layer, so we always kind of working a lot lighter in terms of how we're kind of putting that colour down. So I've got some lovely blues kind of going on in here, and then again it goes back to that kind of greeny kind of shade. So I'm just mixing burnt umber, my Windsor yellow, and a little bit of the cobalt blue that I'm using to get this kind of greeny kind of yellow colour. A bit of blue under there, and then it gets very blue on that side. And then again at the base here, it then goes back to that kind of lovely greeny blue. Hopefully you can see it kind of coming together. So really I'm only kind of putting colour where I can kind of see it, really. Okay, so I'm just going to do the spoon next. Mix up a kind of grey colour. It's a little bit dark, so I'm just going to rinse my brush and just wash that. gets a bit more yellow as it kind of comes down. So I'm just going to drop some, sorry, just drop some kind of darker colour at the top there, where it seems to be a little bit darker and it sort of comes down that side. And then it sort of comes down here in a weird way, and then it almost kind of goes off into different, this kind of got this weird shape where it goes off into two, what looks like two spoons kind of connected, I suppose. Very weird shape here. Okay, I just need to put a little bit of sort of colour on that side, and then really that's it for this stage. So what I will do is go and have a cup of tea and just let this kind of dry, because I don't want to kind of hairdryer it, and you can see actually when I'm at home I very rarely hairdryer the paintings. I kind of tend to just let them dry very sort of naturally. There we go. Yeah, quite happy with that. Of course I'm just going to put the shadow in before I finish up for now. Okay, so I'm just mixing up a kind of purpley shade, and let's see how that works. So I'm hoping that it might work quite well with the kind of yellowy kind of feel up here, so I'm going to go a little bit more kind of purple, you know, by contrast, just to kind of warm everything up. So obviously purple and yellow complementary colours, so hopefully that's going to work quite nicely. And I'm just kind of dragging the brush, as you can see, almost kind of dry brushing, just really sort of letting it drag across the paper. Just going to pick that little bit up there, which I didn't want. Okay, so that's it for now. I'm going to let that dry, and however long it takes. So that might take up to about sort of half an hour to dry. So I'm going to go off, turn the filming off, and come back in half an hour. Okay, see you in a bit.